Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issue of the day. Sheldon, the burning issue of the day today, well, of course, along with all the, stuff that's happening in foreign affairs, which is almost constant with what the empire does, but here domestically is the 50-year anniversary of the War on Poverty. Now, here we are 50 years later, and you see everybody from the left extolling the war on poverty and how we need to wage the war on poverty for, I guess, another 50 years or so. Maybe they want to beat the 100 years record, 100 years war record. But it seems to me that if you've waged a war for 50 years and you're still wanting to wage it some more, that's fairly persuasive proof that your war has failed. I mean, if you can't win a war after 50 years of warfare, that's a pretty strong sign that maybe it's time to abandon and get rid of this war. And in fact, that's exactly what I say we ought to do. Is this thing was a huge mistake. The entire welfare state regulated society, everything Lyndon Johnson did, and of course before him Franklin Roosevelt. Really, when you look at it, it has never been a war on poverty. It's been a war on the poor people. I mean, they have paid the biggest price for this. And this is what the left simply cannot acknowledge with their minimum wage laws and their welfare and their regulations. And it's really a system that has protected the wealthy, the big established firms. It's really just a great big welfare racket. Much like on the foreign policy side, we've got the warfare racket where all the defense contractors and the bureaucrats and the military personnel are making a fortune and killing out of that. I think it's the same thing with this welfare state bureaucracy. You got politicians, bureaucrats, contractors, builders that have all become dependent on this racket. I say it's time to ditch the racket, and the people who would benefit the most from ditching it are the poor. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a great point that if there was a literal war, some foreign land that had gone on for 50 years, a lot of people across the spectrum, progressives and conservatives as well, would be saying, this seems like it's not working. Maybe we should end this. But it's funny, when it's a metaphorical war on poverty, then it can go on 50 years, and their only answer is, well, we must not have done enough, or else we would have won it. The so-called war on poverty seems to me is the ultimate in trickle-down. The other side likes to attack free markets as trickle-down, which is pretty ridiculous. Real radically free markets are bubble-up or bottom-up forms of development. But it's government that's trickled down. I mean, the war on poverty, which has cost about $15 trillion since the late 60s, is a classic case of, as they say, feeding the sparrows through the horses. In other words, they funneled tons of money through a middle-class bureaucracy. So you've got lots of bureaucrats who are middle-class, upper-middle-class, doing very well, running agencies and making very nice salaries. You got a lot of academics who have written endless studies on poverty, and from every sort of angle, who have gotten huge grants. They've done all very well by the war on poverty. There are probably some other groups I've missed. The people who have not done so well are low-income people. Now, I'm all for, I don't like the metaphor of war because I'm anti-war, but I am for an effort against poverty. But the radically freed market is the only way to combat poverty. I mean, people, if you let markets operate, people get wealthier. First of all, they're free to engage in productive activities, which then earn them income, and they, from there, build up and move up and do better and better, and leave money to their kids, who then get a better start than the parents got, and going from there. Government impedes that in countless ways, and this is the old story of where the government breaks the knees and then acts like it's so generous and benevolent because it hands out crutches to help those people whose knees are broken. That's what this so-called war on poverty has been.
Yeah, it's really been a war on wealth. I mean, and that's one of the things that the left never really understands. is, what is it that causes wealth? What is it that causes poverty? They always assume that there's this gigantic pool of wealth that exists in a society, and that all you have to do is have the government decide how much of that wealth is going to be permitted to be kept by its owners and how much is going to be seized and given to those at the bottom of the economic ladder, or to any number of other people, foreign dictators and so forth. But the real question is how does this wealth come into existence? I had a leftist write me the other day, and he says, oh, it's natural resources. And I came back and said, oh, really? Well, why does Mexico have all this oil and remain mired in poverty? Or my recollection was the Soviet Union was filled with natural resources, and yet it was mired in poverty. And so, if you start studying the causes of wealth in a nation, then all of a sudden everything changes, because then you start realizing that when people are free to accumulate wealth, as you were saying earlier, that the poor people have a chance to become wealthy. When you have this radically free market, as you put it, no regulations, that is free enterprise in the genuine sense, enterprise that's free of government control, manipulation, taxation, regulation, then you have all these dynamic opportunities to create wealth, especially for those at the bottom of the economic ladder. They have a chance to become wealthy by providing goods and services that other people want. And then here you have the vital importance of savings in a society, where savings go into productive capital. That capital buys machinery, tools, equipment, tractors, and so forth that make the workers more productive. More productivity increases revenues, which then provides the opportunity to pay for higher wages. And so there's, contrary to what the Marxists and the socialists have always maintained, that there's this conflict between workers and owners. Nonsense. As Bastiat said, there's a natural harmony of interests in the marketplace, where you have a dynamic growing economy that benefits everyone, and especially the poor, because they have a much higher standard of living than if you have a society where the government's confiscating this wealth and trying to equalize it.
Well, right. The conflict occurs when, and typically, historically, employers go to the state to get anti-competitive favors, and which limit entry and otherwise impede would-be competitors. Licensing is a perfectly good example of how the poor are kept poor and how working people have their clout in the marketplace reduced. Just shut off a whole bunch of occupations, so they can't even threaten self-employment as a way of getting a better deal out of an employer. I mean, that's the best way to get something out of your employer. Say, I don't like the terms, I'm going to leave. There's no legal stopping me from opening a business in a particular line of work. But if you shut all that off, you're doing a favor to employers, and you're hurting people. You're locking people in poverty. We libertarians like to say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Milton Friedman kind of made that popular, but Bastiat points out that in a sense there is a free lunch, and this, of course, most benefits, if we want to talk in those terms, low-income people. And his point is that economic advancement, free markets, which include competition and technological progress, turn value into free goods. So, just to put it really simply, over time, if you're getting more for your money, in other words, if the real price of something is dropping and the quality of that thing is even increasing, then you're getting a whole lot of value for free that your ancestors were paying for. That's free goods. And Bastiat talked about how value in a marketplace, value moves from the realm of private property to the communal realm. I'm using Bastiat's terms. And so that's good for people who are starting out low income, and even apart from the work that they can get in a free market, because there's no licensing and other forms of restrictions. They're benefiting. Their real incomes are rising anyway from the free market process. So we must make sure that the government is not putting any impediments in the way of free competition. And of course, as Adam Smith points out all through The Wealth of Nations, business people have always looked for the government to throw barriers up against new competition, because they want to maintain market share and profit. So we libertarians have to be vigilant about that, point that out to people, and also constantly rail against it whenever the government is entertaining a new barrier, but we also must point out all the old ones and call for repeal of them.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned licensing. What about all the big regulations that protect the well-established firms? Because, a startup of poor people that want to start up a business, they can't meet the costs associated with all those big regulations. So the big established firm love all those regulations, the handicap access and all that stuff that poor people can't do. We've talked about minimum wage repeatedly, where they lock out of the labor market black teenagers to the point of there's a 30 to 40% chronic permanent unemployment rate. I mean, where could you find poorer people than that? And of course, you mentioned licensure, which is just a protection racket against, for those that have the licenses. And I think we also ought to talk about the hypocrisy here and expose the left for their hypocrisy. You've got immigration controls that lock the poor from other countries from coming to the United States and bettering their lives. They abuse them, they harass them, they raid them in the private businesses where they're working. They separate their families. They condemn them to a life of poverty in their country of origin. While we libertarians say, hey, open the borders, let people improve their lives. And, when immigrants come in, everybody benefits. It's like what you were suggesting, with trading back and forth in every trade, both sides benefit. And it's not just buying and selling of products. It's also buying and selling of labor services. Both sides of the contract benefit. So there's that hypocrisy. There's also the sanctions and embargoes against poor people. Look what they've done to Cuba for some, 40, 50 years here with this brutal embargo against Cuba. The ones who have borne the brunt of that are the Cuban people, the poor people, who are mired, just about everybody. Now, granted, Cuba's socialist system, which is really a logical extension of the war on poverty here, all their welfare programs and so many people employed by the government and so forth, that's big cause of the poverty, but the sanctions and the embargoes do that too. They did it to Iraq, where they killed, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, virtually all of whom were poor. I mean, it shows you that the left, when you talk about a genuine sense of concern for poor people in general as compared to poor people here in the United States that can vote, to me, the left is just morally bankrupt in this area.
Yeah, and we have to talk about the schools. If we're talking about the war on the poor as opposed to a war on poverty, what better example is there than the schools? The low-income people, the kids of poor people, of low-income people, you might as well attach leg irons to them when they enter the government schools. And a lot of the private schools are just carbon copies anyway, so it's not much different there. What you couldn't devise a better way to handicap young generations, than the government schools. And then you wonder why there's not income mobility when they get older. They go from there to facing the consequences of the minimum wage and occupational licensing and all the restrictions and taxes and regulations that make it tougher for an independent person to launch a business. And then we wonder why there's not been progress on poverty. There is hypocrisy. The people don't want to, who advocate big government approaches to this, don't want to face the consequences of the very things they favor. They just feel better in saying, well, let's just give them more money, and that somehow will undo all the evil things that they do to the poor people every day of the week, and have been doing it for a couple of generations. On the other hand, if you do look at when people are able to have some freedom of action, they improve their situations. I mean, that's not missing from the society. It just takes a lot more effort and money than it would if the government were not in the way. But we see what happens when people do have some freedom of scope to improve their situation. They do it. And we also see how even when markets are permitted to operate to the extent they are in this country, although they're heavily hampered by corporatism and all the things we just talked about. But even there, we see the spread of consumer goods to low-income people to the point where they have, various kinds of goods, household goods and personal goods that much of the middle class didn't have in the 1970s and even into the early 80s. So there's plenty of evidence to show, that goes to empirical evidence that goes to backing up the theoretical point we're making, that the best hope for poor people and low-income people is freedom and a real freed market, in the radical sense, not in the the wishy-washy sense that lots of people talk about it, but really free.
Yeah, your point about education is great. I mean, not even the President of the United States will send his children into Washington, D.C. public schools, and the reason is because he cares about his children, and he's got a choice. He's got the financial means, but it's just a disaster what they've done to people, especially in the inner cities. I mean, if you want to destroy a person's love of learning, especially learning that comes natural to them and what they hope to do and love to do as kids, which many times turns out what they're going to do as adults because they love a particular hobby or whatever. I mean, there's no better way to stamp that out than in the government schooling system, which, we've often argued is just a variation of the Army. I also, though, want to mention, about LBJ in this thing, that the left loves to portray Lyndon Johnson as this great lover of the poor, and that's what the welfare state was all about, and Medicare and Medicaid. This is all nonsense. This guy was politics all the way. I mean, let's not forget that the reason he became president was indirectly because he stuffed the ballot box down in South Texas when he was running for U.S. Senate. It was as illegal as it could be. Johnson was about as crooked as a dog's hind leg. Even on the very day of the assassination, they were investigating him for bribery schemes. I mean, this guy was about power. And that's what the welfare state was all about. He understood that. I grew up in Laredo, Texas, which was a Democratic stronghold. And my dad told me that right after Johnson was elected in 1964, he calls the mayor of Laredo up and he says, "Joe, just tell me how much you want. The federal spigots are now open." And the idea is that money was a way, through these federal grants, was a way to extend political power. You have contracts, you have influence, you have people coming and trying to get part of the largesse, and that you make people dependent on this, public housing projects or Medicare and Medicaid, where you got the extensive amounts of the medical community now dependent on this system, which of course is getting worse and worse and worse. Johnson understood that. And that's what the whole thrust of the war on poverty was about. After all, let's not forget that at the same time he's adopting this so-called war on poverty, he's out there bombing and killing millions of Vietnamese people that were about as poor as you could find, not to mention all the poor people here in the United States that he was drafting, conscripting to go fight this idiotic, destructive war, that 58,000 people died for nothing. I think it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, I was going to say, you anticipated me there. What gets overlooked is his real war on poverty, or the war on the poor. Thanks to Johnson, there were many fewer poor people because he sent a whole bunch of them off to die in rice paddies in Southeast Asia, because predominantly poor low-income poor people went off because you could get a deferment by going to college. So if you had the money to go to college and graduate school, Cheney went had 5 different deferments. If you had some money, you could get to graduate school. You probably could sit out Vietnam pretty safely. But if you dropped out of a really rotten inner city school, or possibly graduated, the draft board was going to grab you right away, make you 1A, and send you off to kill and be killed in Vietnam. That was the real war on the poor. It didn't do much for the systemic causes of poverty, but it made sure there were many fewer poor people, and you were absolutely right to include the Vietnamese in that, because those weren't rich people that were getting killed by the saturation bombing and napalm and stuff like that. So that's the real Johnson record. Yeah, I agree with you that we can't separate this from politics. They talk about Johnson these days like he's some sort of saint. And, one anecdote I know about Johnson is that after he died, some woman approached Lady Bird and said to her, Lady Bird, I just want to tell you how grateful we are for your husband because of the space program. We were just so inspired by the space program. And she smiled and said, Lyndon just wanted to bring jobs to Texas. That pretty much got through them.
Well, but that's revealing of the whole liberal progressive mindset about this jobs deal. I mean, we see it both in the warfare state and the welfare state, where you have this massive bureaucracy of people that as Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, are eating out our substance. And whenever you talk in terms of discontinuing these programs and laying off these workers, they bring up, oh, this would be economically catastrophic, that it would increase unemployment. Well, actually, it's the exact opposite. It would be the greatest thing that could ever happen if you dismantle, well, both the welfare state and the warfare state. Because while it looks like, laying off all these people is like this disastrous type thing, it's actually a doubly positive effect. Because this sector, the welfare warfare sector, for lack of a better word, let's call it the parasitic sector, it depends on the seizure of capital, productive capital from the private sector to sustain itself. So you've got the non-productive sector and the productive sector. And so they're taking, third of the money or half the money or whatever from the productive sector to sustain the public sector. If you lay off all these people, the state will say, oh, that's unemployment. Oh, on the contrary, because now the private sector no longer is having its money seized, so it's now producing things in the private sector with all that money that was previously being seized, new businesses, new job opportunities, new products, new services. But now you also have all the people in the productive sector, the ones that were marching left face and right face, or the ones that receiving welfare for doing nothing. They're now in the productive sector, so they're now producing wealth. So you have a doubly positive effect from dismantling these two sectors. This is what the left doesn't understand. They look at things in a static way that says, oh, just take a picture right now, instead of seeing this as a process on how to reach a dynamic, flourishing, prosperous society in which the poor are benefiting perhaps the most.
Well, that's right. I think there's just a very deep ignorance of how markets work. And I think it goes back to a point I've made at other times, that it's sort of an aesthetic thing. They don't understand the argument for markets, and so they never get to the point of even considering how markets can lift people out of poverty, because they have this aesthetic revulsion to markets. It's profit, it's competition, it's stuff that they find icky. So it doesn't even, it's pre-theoretical. It doesn't even get to the theoretical point where they can make a theoretical rebuttal to what we say, because they're not at that stage. They're still thinking of it in terms of aesthetics. They find it's unattractive that people have to go into the marketplace and compete and bargain, and there's profit as a result. They see competition as being the opposite of cooperation, when we realize that those are two sides of the same coin. Right? Competition is just the result of being free to determine with whom you will cooperate. Right? If there's two shoe stores and I need shoes, they both want to cooperate with me. That puts them in a competitive relationship with each other. But what are they competing to do? They're competing to be the one who cooperates with me in my efforts to obtain shoes. So you can't separate cooperation from competition. As long as it's free and open competition, which means no government putting its thumb on the scale on behalf of anybody, because it's always going to end up putting it on behalf of the powerful, and that's going to hurt the least powerful, the most vulnerable. Those are going to tend to be low-income people, because they don't have good connections. They don't have the know-how to get through the halls of Congress. They're too busy trying to earn a living, get together a living for themselves and their kids. So this system will always be to the detriment of the very people the progressives claim that they want to help. And, how do you get them to look at this? I don't know. They don't want to look past their initial revulsion at things like I say, competition and market relationships.
I think we've got a much better shot at convincing the poor, the lower strata of America on an economic basis, that all this junk is not in their favor. And if the lower strata economically of American society ever figures that out, then the gig's up, because now the left won't have the poor to justify all their statism. And I think a lot of what guides us is envy. That in a radically freed market, you'd have inequalities of wealth. You'd have people making a lot more than other people. I mean, that's just the dynamics of a marketplace, that consumers place higher values on, movie stars. They patronize their movies and so forth than they do a professor of humanities in some university. And so there's going to be disparities of income in a radically freed market. But I think that really bothers the progressives, is that their sense of envy and covetousness. They can't stand it, that somebody else has more while they have less. And so they see this ever-growing pie, economic pie, and they can't stand themselves. They say, oh, I want to take from him and give it to these people over here. And if for a while the party looks great, the people that are receiving it are saying, "Oh, this is wonderful," and man, wow, my life's better off. I'm living off this plunder and this loot. Much as a thief would be better off, as soon as he walks out with somebody's money that he's stolen. But over time, the pie starts to shrink. The marginal businesses start going out of business. Unemployment starts rising. And more and more people want to be on the receiving end because it's free money. And then things start to contract, which is, of course, what's happened in countries like North Korea and Cuba. To a certain extent, it's happening in the United States. And so really the solution is, how do we keep these people on the left from implementing their envy and their covetousness into the governmental system that is intended to steal from those who have more and give to those who have less? Finally, I just want to point out that in this dynamic, growing society, the people at the bottom of the economic ladder are the ones that are benefiting tremendously, not just in terms of becoming wealthy, but also those that take vows of poverty, let's say. That a Catholic nun here in the United States, even though we know we don't have a free market system now, but we have a lot more wealth in this society, she's going to do much better off than her counterpart who takes a vow of poverty in Guatemala, simply because of the spillover effects that come with bigger donations that are coming from the wealthy and the middle class to sustain charitable activities, more options of grocery stores to buy in, better facilities to live in. It shows you that in a prospering, dynamic, growing society, the people at the bottom of the economic ladder are going to benefit tremendously.
Yeah, I would add 2 points on disparity of income. The idea of equal income is ridiculous because people are different, and in a truly free society, incomes are going to differ just because people are different at serving consumers. And it's the old idea that Will Chamberlain, the people want to watch a great ball player, is going to tend to make a lot of money because people are willing to pay a lot to go see him. Versus someone who doesn't have those talents. So we would expect differences, but that shouldn't stop us from recognizing that in a state capitalist system, a crony capitalist system, whatever you want to call it, like we have today, those differences are exacerbated because huge fortunes can be made by exploiting the system, and I would contend that accounts for a lot of what we see at the higher end in finance, for example, where it's thoroughly saturated with government. So the fact that there will be differences of income in a truly free market is not a license for us to then belittle the differences that exist today, which I think too many people do, including libertarians. We should take those very seriously because they are the result of government intervention. The other thing I'd say, I think we should single out John Stuart Mill here, who's regarded as a classical liberal and had many merits, but he did one very, very bad thing in teaching people about economics and his principles of economics, where he separated production from distribution. In fact, he says at one point, we've solved the problem of production. He thought that was just a scientific issue. We figured out how to produce lots of stuff. Now we have to solve the problem of distribution. That was a terrible move to make. It's also inaccurate because in a true market, there's no separate distribution system, right? If I produce a product and then you say, hey, I'd like that, and we come up with terms to exchange it, I haven't distributed the product to you. We've engaged in exchange of private property, of properly owned belongings, right? You said, I'll give you this amount of money if you give me that thing. And I said, okay, I like that deal. I'll take it. And we change. There's not a separate distribution system. But the moment Mill said that, and that was carried on by the other British economists later on, and still it dominates thinking today, there's this idea that distribution is separate, and further, that no matter what we do in the distribution realm, it won't affect the production realm. and you already alluded to this, as if we can do anything as far as, quote, redistributing wealth, and that won't affect production. But of course, it will. It creates disincentives, which you've already said, to production, so you get fewer things are produced. Because if the government's going to take it from you, why would you invest? Why would you make a long-term investment in anticipation of returns if the government's going to seize it from you anyway? So you can't get involved. The government can't get involved in, quote, distribution without affecting production. And so it was a double or triple bad mistake by Mill that we still suffer from.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And you mentioned crony capitalism, and really crony capitalism really is just a variation of socialism. And I think that's where the left doesn't understand that once you give government the power to seize money from one sector of society in order to give it to another sector, i.e. the poor people or the people that need medical care, the people who need retirement help, that the floodgates are now opened, where the money can be seized and given to anybody, including the wealthy Wall Street people, the big corporations that are struggling in the marketplace to satisfy consumers and aren't doing it too successfully, the dictators. I mean, look how much money is given to the Egyptian military dictators today, or any number of other dictatorships in the Middle East and Latin America and so forth. So the whole war on poverty really is not only benefiting a small sector of people that are in the poorer sectors that are receiving this money, and really, I think, destroying their spirit of independence and can-do and so forth, but it's also benefiting a lot of rich people. And as compared to our libertarian idea, where we say, hey, leave people free to keep everything they earn, engage in economic enterprise free of government control and regulation, and then you're going to see some real economic prosperity and growth. In any event, that's the show. That's the Libertarian Angle for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoyed it as always, Sheldon, and we'll see you all next time.